The government stole $40,000 from my small business, and there's nothing I can do about it except for make this video and tell my story. You've probably heard of tariffs.
US tariffs against China add up to 145%.
The fees that we're supposedly charging China and other countries who trade with the United States so we can rebuild domestic manufacturing in America. Sounds like a great goal, one that I personally agree with, and a great plan if it actually works. However, there are just a few little problems with it. Number one, China doesn't actually pay for the tariffs, which I can prove because I have the receipts. Two, this is a complete disaster for small businesses in America and will actually make it harder for them to manufacture domestically, which I'll explain. Number three, consumers are about to get crushed by higher prices. And number four, if you look a little bit deeper, revitalizing domestic manufacturing is clearly not the goal of the tariffs. It's something else, which I will explain. But before I get to the details of how the government stole $40,000 from me, I should say that my name is Kyle. You're watching Solid Strat, and this is a channel dedicated to teaching solid strategies for content creation, business development, and building a lifestyle that you own. I'm an entrepreneur myself. I started my first business 15 years ago, and I quit my job shortly after. I need you to keep two things in mind while you are watching this video. Number one, my goal is to just be informational and to give you a different perspective than what you're seeing on TV right now, because two, the people on TV are either dumb or they are lying to you. And either way, they're just talking about the situation. I am actually living it. I'm one of the less than 1% of Americans who owns a small manufacturing business that has been directly impacted by the situation. I make stuff in the US. I make stuff overseas. I've paid the tariffs. I know how they work, so I'm more qualified to speak to this matter than at least 99% of the people in this country. So to give you a bit of backstory, the business I started is called Clawhammer Supply. We make homebrewing and distillation equipment, basically tools that allow folks to make their own beer, high-proof alcohol, essential oils, distilled water, and more. We actually make as much stuff as possible here in the US, but like every other business in America, we are reliant on a global supply chain, even for the stuff that we make locally. For example, a lot of the stuff we sell is made with stainless steel, and although we might use the stainless steel fitting that's made by a US company, the chromium used to make that stainless steel almost certainly comes from outside of the US because there's virtually no chromium mining in America. The largest chromium mine in the world is in South Africa, which is where most of the chromium used in the US comes from. And it just got a lot more expensive because of the tariffs. So speaking of, what exactly is a tariff? People like to argue about whether or not a tariff is a tax. Well, whatever you call it, a tariff is a fee charged by the government on an item imported into the country, which sounds an awful lot like a tax, but it doesn't actually matter what you call it. What's far more important is knowing who pays the tariffs. The truth is that the company that imports a product into the United States pays the tariff. So tariffs are charged to businesses, not countries. For example, let's just say that my American business imports $100,000 of stuff into the US from China. When the goods hit port in the US, the current tariff on Chinese goods, for example, is 147% for a container of goods made in China valued at $100,000. My company would owe the United States government $147,000. So the cost of my goods, not including the shipping cost, just the cost of the goods and the tariffs alone, would be $247,000 total. The $100,000 that I paid for the goods initially, and then an additional $147,000 tariff. And let's just be honest, it's a tax, which I was not expecting to pay when I started production of my last batch of goods, which began months and months ago. China pays nothing in this scenario. They pay $0 in fees. I, the American business owner, pay all of the fees. So that's how the tariffs impact me. But how do tariffs impact consumers? Simply put, Tariffs cause the price of goods in the United States to increase, and here is exactly how that works. First, let's assume that I sell a product for $100. It's very likely that that product only cost me $50 to make. That's because, as a rule of thumb, retailers typically double the price of goods they make or purchase from wholesalers. If a wholesale product originally cost $50 but is subject to a roughly 150% tariff, the new wholesale price of the item is $50 plus $75 for a total of $125. Once the retailer doubles that based on standard margins, the new price of the item is $250. Nothing changed but the tariff. So the original item that used to sell for $100 now sells for $250. Who pays that? The consumers. And how much do they pay? They pay a lot. And you might be thinking, wow, you double the price of the stuff you sell compared to what you make it for? Yes, absolutely. It's very common, and here's why. The wholesale manufacturing price of a product doesn't include a lot of other costs. I still have to pay myself. I have to pay my employees. I have to pay my marketing costs, my office mortgage, my warehouse mortgage, vehicle loans, insurance, and so on. So I at least need to double the price of an item if I want to stay in business. So these tariffs are a complete disaster for small businesses and consumers, and they recently cost me $40,000, which I was not expecting to pay, and here's how that worked out. The new tariffs were announced in February of 2025. At first, they were supposed to be just 10%. I had manufacturers in China start producing goods for me at the end of 2024, so these goods were already in production. They were ready early February, and right before we were about to ship them, the current administration announced that there was going to be a 10% tariff on any goods coming in from China. And a lot of businesses that import from China, including me, basically said, all right, no big deal. The goods are ready. Let's just go ahead and ship them, and we'll just eat the 10% and move on with our lives. But here's the thing. Goods from China don't just show up overnight. They're typically on the water for at least 30 to 45 days before they even reach a U.S. port. And right in the middle of that shipping window in early March, the administration changed the rules. They said, oh, actually, when we said 10%, we meant 20. So if your container was already floating in the middle of the ocean at that point, you're out of luck. Now you're paying 20% instead of 10. And that's exactly what happened to me. I had about $200,000 of goods en route, and when they hit port, I had to pay an extra $40,000 just to get my products released. And yeah, I was lucky enough to actually be able to pay it, but that wasn't extra money that was just sitting around. That was money that I had been saving for a long time. That was money that I was about to use to buy a machine to manufacture a new product here in the United States. And it was gone overnight. So you tell me, did that tariff help me bring any manufacturing back to the United States? Like I said, I'm supportive of any plan that will help create American jobs. I'm from a small town in Northwest Ohio with a strong manufacturing base. I know a lot of people who work in factories and worked in factories when I was a kid, including members of my own family. So I know firsthand the value of a good factory job. In fact, one of the things I was worried about as a kid was a factory closing and one of my parents losing their jobs. Thankfully, that never happened, but it was always a risk. So I'm very supportive of keeping American jobs and onshoring and reshoring jobs that we've lost. But onshoring manufacturing is not the goal of these current tariffs. It can't be, because the new tariffs are actually going to make manufacturing in the US more difficult, not easier. And here's how. Bringing jobs back to the US isn't a flip a switch kind of thing. For a company like mine, it would take years to rebuild an entirely domestic supply chain. Where is that money supposed to come from, especially when the government just unexpectedly applied a 20% tariff to my last materials orders and stole $40,000 out of my pocket that I hadn't budgeted for? And honestly, you know what? That was best case scenario. It's even worse now because the tariffs aren't 20% anymore. They're pushing 150%. So let's just say a US business is doing $1 million a year in sales and most of their products are sourced from China. $1.2 million. That's $500,000, the original cost of the goods, plus $735,000 in tariffs. So here's the question. How is a business that was originally doing $1 million a year in sales supposed to come up with more than $1.2 million extra just to keep their supply chain moving, all while trying to rebuild everything domestically at the same time. It is completely impossible. So why won't the new tariffs bring jobs back to the US? If a company just blew all of their spare cash paying tariffs just to get the goods they had already produced off a ship, where exactly are they supposed to find the money to rebuild everything here from scratch? Where's the money coming from to buy new machines, to lease or buy space to house the machines, to hire and train a workforce to run the machines, to buy a new forklift, to buy new pallet racks, to pay for insurance that just doubled overnight, to cover a new utility bill that's 5 times as high as it used to be, to upgrade the wiring and the ventilation and the sprinkler systems just to meet code, to drop 50 grand on tooling that nobody thought about, to buy raw materials in massive minimum order quantities because suppliers don't do small favors, to float payroll while production ramps up, to survive 6, 12, 18 months of delays without going under. Meanwhile, their margins are already wrecked, the cash is gone, no bank on earth is about to step in and save them. This is not a plan to rebuild American manufacturing. It's a plan to wipe out everyone who can't write a 7-figure check tomorrow. And to be clear, the people who could do that probably won't. Think about it. One day tariffs are 0%, then they're 20%, then they're 50 or 60%, then the markets crash and everything but China gets paused for 90 days with zero guidance on exactly what's going to happen at the end of that period. It is impossible to make any legitimate medium to long-term plans in this chaos, even if you have no idea what I'm talking about from a business logistics perspective. Just look at the stock market, because Wall Street is well aware of the impact of this absolutely ridiculous policymaking. $6.6 trillion was lost from the US stock market in the 2 days following Trump's reciprocal tariff announcement, which is absolutely crazy because the tariffs are only expected to generate $225 billion this year. The math just isn't mathing here. We lost $6.6 trillion in the US market to make $225 billion? Are you kidding me? When I was a kid, I never said, when I grow up, I want to buy a bunch of crap from China and resell it in the United States. This isn't the system I created. This is a system that I inherited, and I played by the rules that the US government and the global economy set until they changed them overnight and stole $40,000 from my business and left me hanging. And they're calling it a plan to save American jobs. Give me a break. If the US government actually cared about boosting domestic manufacturing, they'd be offering real incentives. I'm talking about subsidizing the resources we actually need to make things here. But they're not doing that. So I'm going to stop right there because I'd just be wasting my breath. That's not happening. There is a plan, and it's not subsidies. It's tax breaks, which, if you know anything about taxes, are absolutely worthless if your business isn't making any money. You only pay taxes on profit. And after getting wrecked by these tariffs, a lot of small businesses aren't going to be owing taxes for a very long time. So a tax break will do them no good. But honestly, it doesn't even matter because the tax breaks were never meant for small businesses anyway. The real goal of the tariffs and the government's spending cuts is to offset the cost of making the 2017 tax cuts permanent. Tax cuts that, by the way, overwhelmingly favored the wealthiest Americans, not small businesses, not the middle class, and certainly not the poor. How do I know this? The very next day after announcing sweeping tariffs on every country in the world, the House passed their 2025 budget resolution aimed at making the 2017 tax cuts, which again favored the very rich, permanent. Obviously, people making over 7 figures a year are overjoyed, and I'm also actually hearing a bunch of noise about the bill potentially eliminating income taxes entirely for people making under $100,000 a year, which actually sounds like a great idea, I'm sure, to people making $100,000 a year or less, unless you actually vet that idea, which turns out is an absolutely terrible deal for those people. For example, a family of 4 with a combined income of $100,000 only pays about $4,000 a year in federal income taxes after credits and deductions. But that same family could easily spend $25,000 a year on groceries, clothes, household goods, tech, appliances, vehicles, etc. Essential stuff. And if prices go up just 20% because of tariffs, and they will, that family could be paying an extra $5,000 a year just to live, which is a net increase of $1,000. So no, they're not eliminating taxes for the middle and lower class. They're just swapping the income tax that you can see for a stealth tax that's hidden and baked into the price of every single thing you buy, which will result in you actually paying more. If this makes sense to you, please share it with somebody you think who could benefit from this information. Hit the like button, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.